A diner at 2 in the morning is a sanctuary for the insomniacs and the damned. Declan sat in the corner booth, staring at his cold coffee, a man hollowed out by a 4-year-old funeral. Then the tired waitress leaned over to refill his mug. A heavy chain slipped from beneath her collar, catching the fluorescent light. A custom-cut sapphire surrounded by crushed diamonds, the exact piece he'd buried with his wife. He grabbed her wrist, the diner, plunging into dead silence. "That's my late wife's necklace," he roared. And then she looked him dead in the eye and whispered the impossible. The rain in Boston didn't fall. It spat. It hit the greasy windows of the Starlight Diner, like thrown gravel, distorting the neon glow of the street lamps into ugly bleeding streaks of yellow. Inside, the air smelled of burnt filter coffee, industrial bleach, and the damp wool of cheap coats. Declan sat in the furthest booth in the back. He didn't mind the smell. It grounded him. The high-end restaurants he owned downtown smelled of truffles and ozone-sterile places filled with men who smiled while calculating how to slit your throat. The Starlight was honest. It was a place for people who had nowhere else to be. At 38, Declan Rossi looked like a man who had spent the last decade walking against a gale-force wind. His tailored charcoal suit hung flawlessly on his broad frame, but his face carried the true toll of his life. Dark circles bruised the skin beneath his eyes. A thin, pale scar dragged from his left temple down to his jawbone, a souvenir from a life he had supposedly conquered. He was the head of the Rossi Syndicate, the undisputed king of the city's underworld. He had money, territory, and fear. He had absolutely nothing. 4 years ago, a car bomb had turned his wife, Camille, into ash and memory. Declan had spent the following 18 months dismantling the rival crew he believed responsible. He hadn't just killed them, he had erased them. He had burned their businesses, exiled their families, and buried their lieutenants under the foundations of the new high-rises going up in the seaport. When the blood finally stopped flowing, the city held its breath, waiting for the king to take his throne. Instead, Declan simply stopped living. He went through the motions. He collected the envelopes, nodded at the meetings, and stared at the walls of his empty estate until the silence became a physical pressure in his ears. That was why he was here, at 2 in the morning, nursing a ceramic mug of sludge. Sleep was an enemy he could no longer fight. 2 booths away, Thomas and Cole sat in silence. They were his shadow's men, built like freight trains, nursing their own coffees and watching the door. They knew better than to speak to him when the insomnia was this heavy. Behind the counter, Amelia wiped down the laminate surface for the 4th time in an hour. Her feet throbbed in her cheap, slip-resistant sneakers, sending dull aches up her calves. She was 32, but the graveyard shift had a way of adding a decade to your bones. A stray strand of auburn hair fell across her face, and she blew it out of her eyes with a frustrated huff, leaving a smudge of mascara on her cheekbone. She wanted to go home. Her apartment was tiny, the radiator clanked like a dying engine, and the rent was 2 weeks late, but it was quiet. She glanced at the clock. 2 hours left. She looked over at the 3 men in the back. They hadn't touched their food. Amelia had been working diners long enough to recognize the predators from the prey. These men weren't cops. Cops wore their exhaustion differently. These men wore stillness. The 2 near the front were muscle-plain and simple. But the man in the corner, the one staring into his mug like it held the secrets of the universe, he was the gravity in the room. Everything pulled toward him. Amelia picked up the glass coffee pot from the burner. The orange decaf ring was peeling off. She grabbed a damp cloth, wiped her hands, and walked out from behind the counter. The squeak of her rubber soles against the linoleum was the only sound in the diner besides the humming refrigerator. She approached the muscle first. Thomas put a hand over his cup, not even looking up. Cole just shook his head. Amelia moved to the corner booth. Up close, the man's presence was suffocating. He didn't look dangerous in the frantic, twitchy way the junkies on the corner did. He looked dangerous the way a dormant volcano did. "Warm that up for you," Amelia asked, her voice raspy from disuse. Declan didn't look up. He just gave a fractional nod, shifting his shoulders slightly to make room. Amelia leaned over the table, angling the pot to avoid splashing the man's expensive cuffs. As she reached forward, the top button of her uniform blouse pulled taut. The safety pin she'd used to keep the frayed collar together gave way. Gravity did the rest. From beneath her collar, a heavy silver chain slipped free, dropping forward to swing like a pendulum over the table. Declan blinked, his eyes unfocused, and dead lazily tracked the movement. The pendant caught the harsh, buzzing light of the fluorescent tubes overhead. It was a sapphire. But not just any sapphire. It was the size of a quail's egg, cut in a highly specific teardrop shape, surrounded by a halo of crushed diamonds set in platinum. Declan's breath stopped in his throat. The air in his lungs turned to ice. His brain, usually a machine of cold calculation, short-circuited. He knew that stone. He had flown a man in from Antwerp to cut it. He had designed the platinum setting himself, spending hours arguing with the jeweler about the prongs. He had clasped it around Camille's neck on their 3rd anniversary, kissing the nape of her neck as she laughed at the sheer weight of it. He knew the tiny, almost imperceptible flaw on the bottom left clasp, where he had accidentally knocked it against a champagne flute. He had buried Camille in a closed casket. The coroner had handed him a plastic bag of melted personal effects. The necklace hadn't been in it. They told him it had likely melted or been destroyed in the blast. And now it was swinging freely over a chipped mug in a diner that smelled of grease and failure. Declan didn't think. He reacted. His hand shot across the table like a striking snake. His large, calloused fingers closed around Amelia's wrist, gripping bone and tendon with terrifying force. The glass coffee pot slipped from Amelia's other hand. It hit the linoleum floor with a sharp, explosive crash, sending a wave of scalding black liquid and jagged shards in every direction. The sound shattered the heavy silence of the diner. Instantly, Thomas and Cole were on their feet. Chairs scraped violently against the floor. Suit jackets flew open, and the dull, heavy metal of suppressed sidearms gleamed in the dim light. The only other patron in the diner, a drunk sleeping off a bender in a booth near the bathrooms, bolted upright, took one look at the guns and scrambled out the back fire exit, the alarm blaring for a half-second before the heavy door slammed shut. Declan didn't notice the guns, the spilled coffee, or the fleeing drunk. His entire universe had narrowed to the terrified face of the woman in front of him and the blue fire of the stone resting against her collarbone. He stood up, his grip on her wrist, tightening. He pulled her across the table, knocking over the salt and pepper shakers. "Boss!" Thomas warned, stepping forward, his eyes scanning the windows for threats. He thought it was an assassination attempt, a poisoner, a setup. Declan ignored him. His chest heaved, a sudden violent rhythm hammering against his ribs. The stoic, dead-eyed mob boss was gone, replaced by a man drowning in a sudden, violent resurgence of grief. "Where did you get this?" Declan's voice was barely a rasp, choked with a dry, jagged emotion that felt like swallowing glass. Amelia gasped, her free hand, coming up to grab his thick forearm, trying to pry his fingers off. The pain was immediate and blinding. It felt like her radius was about to snap under the pressure of a vice. "Let go of me!" she cried out, twisting her body. Declan yanked her closer, his face inches from hers. The smell of his cologne cedar and cold rain mixed with the burnt coffee. "I said, where did you get it?" His voice escalated, vibrating with a desperate, terrifying fury. He pointed a trembling finger at the sapphire. Did she steal it? Did she rob a grave? Did she buy it in some pawn shop from the men who planted the bomb? The men he had supposedly killed. The implications tore through Declan's mind, unspooling 4 years of grim acceptance in a matter of seconds. "You're hurting me." Amelia panicked, her breathing erratic. She looked at the 2 men standing behind him, guns drawn, their faces blank slates of violence. She was going to die here. Over a piece of jewelry she should have kept hidden. "That's my late wife's necklace," Declan roared, the sound tearing out of his throat, animalistic and raw. The sheer volume of it seemed to rattle the greasy windows. The words hit Amelia like a physical blow. The frantic struggling stopped. She froze, her chest heaving as she stared at the man holding her captive. Her eyes darted over his features, mapping the frantic, devastated landscape of his face. She saw the dark eyes practically black with sorrow. She saw the pale scar cutting down his jawline. She saw a man who looked like he had been carrying a corpse on his back for years. "He looks like a storm, Amelia." Dark eyes, a scar pulling at his jawline, a mouth that forgets how to smile. The description echoed in Amelia's mind, a ghost whispering from a desert motel room 3 years ago. The panic drained out of Amelia, replaced by a cold, heavy shock. She wasn't looking at a random thug. She was looking at the ghost she had been waiting for. Her posture changed. She stopped pulling away. The fear in her eyes hardened into something entirely different. Pity. Deep, profound pity. Declan felt the shift in her. He saw the terror leave her, which confused him more than if she had pulled a knife. People didn't stop being afraid of him unless they were dead. Amelia swallowed hard, holding his furious gaze. "Let me go," she said. It wasn't a plea this time. It was an instruction. "Not until you tell me." Declan snarled, though his grip loosened slightly, just enough to let her blood flow again. "Her name was Camille," Amelia said, her voice steady, cutting through the heavy air of the diner like a surgical blade. Declan went entirely still, the breath caught in his throat. Hearing her name spoken aloud by a stranger felt like a gunshot to the chest. Amelia reached up with her free hand, gently but firmly prying Declan's loosened fingers off her wrist. She stepped back, rubbing the angry red marks blooming on her pale skin. She didn't look at the guns. She only looked at Declan, she told me. Amelia whispered the words, heavy with the weight of a long-kept secret. "That you'd have that exact look on your face when I finally found you." The diner was dead silent, save for the rhythmic drip-drip of the spilled coffee leaking off the edge of the counter and hitting the linoleum. Declan felt the floor drop out from under him. The edges of his vision darkened, fraying into static. He reached blindly for the edge of the table to steady himself, his knuckles turning white as he gripped the laminate. "When I finally found you," the words didn't make sense. They defied logic, physics, and the brutal reality of the closed casket he had paid 20 grand for. He had seen the police reports. He had smelled the burning rubber and charred metal on the street. "Lock the doors," Declan commanded, his voice, devoid of all its previous volume, reduced to a hollow mechanical frequency. Thomas and Cole moved instantly. Cole walked to the front door, flipped the neon open sign to closed, and twisted the deadbolt. Thomas moved to the back, checking the fire exit, and pulling the heavy metal security bar across it. Amelia didn't try to run. She knew this moment was inevitable from the day she accepted the necklace. She walked over to the counter, grabbed a clean mug, poured herself a cup of black coffee from the backup pot, and walked back to the booth. She slid into the vinyl seat opposite Declan. Declan sank slowly into his side of the booth. He stared at her, waiting. He didn't threaten her. He didn't need to. 3 years ago, Amelia began wrapping both hands around the hot mug to stop them from shaking. I wasn't living in Boston. I was working the graveyard shift at a motel off Route 66 in the middle of nowhere, Arizona, a place called the Stardust. It was a dusty, rotting place where people went when they didn't want to be found. Declan didn't blink. He just listened, cataloguing every word, searching for the lie. It was a Tuesday. Amelia continued, her eyes distant, pulling the memory from the dark corner of her mind. Raining like it is tonight. A woman stumbled into the lobby. She was wearing a cheap tracksuit, soaked through, and she was holding her side. She looked like she had been dragged behind a truck. Black eye, split lip, and a fever burning so hot I could feel it standing 3 feet away. Camille. Declan breathed the name, tasting like ash. She didn't give me her name at first, Amelia said. She offered me a stack of cash, more money than I made in 2 years, to give her a room, off the books, bring her medical supplies, and forget I ever saw her. Amelia took a sip of her coffee. I was broke. I needed the money, so I took it. I put her in room 9 at the back of the lot. I bought bandages, antibiotics, painkillers. What was wrong with her? Declan asked, his voice tightening. He had spent years imagining her death as instantaneous. A flash of light and then nothing. The idea of her suffering, stumbling through the rain in pain, tore at the stitched wounds in his mind. She had a gunshot wound, Amelia said flatly. A through and through on her right side. It was infected. Declan frowned, the gears in his head grinding. A gunshot, not a bomb. Amelia shook her head slowly. The bomb wasn't meant for her, Declan. Or rather, it was meant to cover up the fact that she was already gone. She wasn't in the car when it blew. Declan leaned forward, the leather of his jacket groaning. Who? He asked. Just one word, but it contained 1,000 acts of violence. She said you wouldn't believe it, Amelia said, her voice softening with empathy. She said you'd tear the city apart, looking for the people who did it, and you'd look right past the man sitting at your own table. Declan's jaw clenched. The muscles in his neck stood out like steel cables. Give me a name, Amelia. She called him Garrett, Amelia said. The name hit the air between them like a physical grenade. Declan recoiled, a sharp intake of breath hissing through his teeth. Garrett, his underboss, his best man at his wedding, the man who had stood beside him at Camille's funeral, holding an umbrella over Declan's head while the rain pounded the earth, the man who had personally handed Declan the intelligence on the rival Chicago crew, pointing the finger at them for the bombing. No, Declan whispered, shaking his head. Garrett is blood. Garrett is a traitor, Amelia said, her tone unyielding. She wasn't intimidated by his denial. She was just delivering the truth. Camille found out he was skimming. Worse, she found out he was feeding information to the feds to build a RICO case against you, in exchange for immunity and taking over the syndicate once you were locked up. Declan closed his eyes. Pieces of a 4-year-old puzzle suddenly started snapping into place with sickening clarity. The rival crew had gone down too easily. The feds had strangely backed off their investigations into Garrett's territories while squeezing Declan's. The phantom leaks. She confronted him, Amelia continued. She told him she was going to tell you, but Garrett controlled your security detail that day. He pulled a gun on her in the garage. He shot her, but she managed to get into a second car and crash through the gate. He set off the bomb in her primary car to make it look like an assassination, burning a Jane Doe to hide his tracks and buy himself time. Declan opened his eyes. They were no longer hollow. They were burning. A cold, absolute fire had ignited behind his irises. Where is she? He demanded, leaning forward, the desperation returning. If she survived, if she ran, Where is she now?" Amelia looked down at her hands. She let go of the coffee mug and reached up to the back of her neck. Her fingers fumbled with the clasp of the heavy sapphire necklace. Declan watched her, his heart hammering a frantic, devastating beat against his ribs. Amelia undid the clasp. She pulled the chain away from her neck and gently laid the necklace on the table, pushing it across the laminate until it rested in front of Declan. The infection. Amelia whispered, a tear finally breaking free and tracking through the mascara on her cheek. She survived the gunshot, but her body was broken. She couldn't go to a real hospital because Garrett had eyes everywhere. She lingered for 6 months in that motel room. I took care of her. We talked every night. She told me everything about you. Declan stared at the necklace. The blue stone seemed to mock him, a bright, beautiful thing in a world composed entirely of rot. She died 3 years ago, Declan. Amelia said gently, reaching across the table to place a hand over his. He didn't pull away. He was trembling. Before she passed, she gave me this. She said she was sorry she couldn't come back to you, but she made me promise that if I ever left the desert, if I ever made it to the East Coast, I would find you, and I would tell you the truth. Declan picked up the necklace. It felt heavy in his palm, the weight of his wife's final months, the weight of his own blinding grief, the weight of 4 years of misplaced vengeance. He had burned down the wrong house. He had killed the wrong men, and the man who had actually taken his world away was coming to his estate for breakfast in 4 hours. Declan slowly closed his fist around the sapphire, the sharp edges of the diamonds biting into his skin. He welcomed the pain. It was sharp, focused, and real. The suffocating fog of mourning that had paralyzed him for 4 years evaporated, replaced by a crystalline, terrifying clarity. He stood up from the booth. He wasn't the broken man who had walked into the diner an hour ago. He was the king again, and his crown was forged in absolute, unadulterated rage. Thomas. Declan said, his voice echoing in the quiet diner. It was cold. It was the voice of a man signing a death warrant. "Yeah, boss." Thomas stepped forward. "Call Garrett," Declan instructed, slipping the necklace into his breast pocket right over his heart. "Tell him breakfast is moved up. Tell him to meet me at the warehouse on the docks." "The meatpacking plant, sir. It's 3 a.m. Declan turned his head, fixing Thomas with a stare that made the seasoned killer take a half step back. "Tell him," Declan said softly, "I have a surprise for him." The docks at Pier 47 smelled of brine rust and the metallic tang of old blood. The meatpacking plant sat at the edge of the water, a massive, windowless cinder-block structure that hummed with the low industrial vibration of heavy-duty freezers. It was a place designed for slaughter and storage, making it the perfect venue for the Rossi Syndicate's internal audits. Inside, the air was aggressively cold. Frost clung to the stainless steel rails overhead, where halved carcasses of beef hung from heavy iron hooks. The only light came from caged bulbs, spaced evenly along the concrete ceiling, casting long, swinging shadows across the floor drains. Declan sat on a wooden shipping crate in the center of the main floor. He wore his heavy cashmere overcoat, the collar turned up against the chill, his hands resting loose on his thighs. He didn't shiver. He hadn't felt the cold since he walked out of the Starlight Diner. He felt completely hollowed out, a vessel filled with nothing but absolute freezing clarity. 30 years. He had known Garrett for 30 years. They had stolen bicycles together in Southie. They had taken their first beatings together in the back alleys of the North End. When Declan took his first bullet in a turf war, it was Garrett who dragged him into a basement and dug the lead out with a paring knife. They were supposed to be the untamable two, the king and his shadow. and the shadow had burned the queen to take the throne. The heavy steel door at the front of the warehouse groaned, open grooved hinges screaming against the quiet. Garrett stepped inside. Even at 3 a.m, Garrett looked like he had just stepped off a yacht. He wore a tailored camel hair coat over a black turtleneck, his silver hair perfectly swept back. He was a handsome man, charming and smooth, possessing a politician's smile that had talked the syndicate out of a dozen federal indictments. He walked with a casual arrogance, flanked by 2 of his own men. Garrett called out, his voice echoing off the frosted tiles. He rubbed his gloved hands together, his breath pluming in the freezing air. Jesus Christ, what is this? We couldn't do this at the cigar lounge. It's a brass monkey out here. Declan didn't move. He just watched Garrett approach. Cole stepped out from the shadows near the entrance, holding a suppressed semi-automatic rifle across his chest. Thomas mirrored him on the opposite side of the room. Garrett's 2 men paused their hands, instinctively twitching toward their coats, but Garrett waved them off with a dismissive flick of his wrist. "Relax," Garrett told his muscle. He turned his attention back to Declan, flashing that easy, familiar smile. "Late-night emergency at the docks. Let me guess. The shipment from Halifax got held up by customs again. I told you we should have routed it through Providence." Declan stared at him. He looked at the lines around Garrett's eyes. He looked at the expensive watch glinting on his wrist. He looked for any sign of a monster, but all he saw was his oldest friend. That was the most terrifying part of betrayal. It never came from your enemies. It came from the people who knew exactly where to insert the knife. "The Halifax shipment is fine," Declan said. His voice was flat, devoid of its usual booming authority. It was a dead sound. Garrett stopped 10 feet away. The smile slipped a fraction, recognizing the shift in Declan's tone. He had seen Declan in 100 different moods, enraged, grieving, ruthless. But he had never seen him like this. This stillness was unnatural. Then what are we doing here? "Dick," Garrett asked, his tone dropping an octave, shifting from banter to business. "You look like hell. You haven't been sleeping again. You want to talk? We can talk. But let's do it somewhere I don't risk losing my toes to frostbite." "I had a conversation tonight," Declan said, slowly, ignoring the complaint. Garrett sighed, sliding his hands into his coat pockets. "With who? The Italians? If they're trying to renegotiate the waterfront percentages again, I swear to God, with a waitress." Garrett blinked. The non sequitur derailed his train of thought. A waitress." "Yeah." Declan stood up from the crate. The movement was slow, deliberate. "She worked the graveyard shift, a quiet place. Said she used to work out west, Arizona." For a fraction of a second, the air in the warehouse changed. It wasn't something you could see, but something you could feel. A sudden microscopic tightening of the atmosphere. Garrett's left eye developed a faint twitch. His posture didn't change, but his shoulders locked, bracing against an invisible impact. "Arizona," Garrett repeated. The word sounded dry in his mouth. He swallowed hard, his Adam's apple, bobbing against the collar of his turtleneck. "Nice this time of year, I hear." Declan stepped forward, the rubber soles of his Oxfords squeaking against the frost-covered concrete. "She told me a story, Garrett. A long, ugly story about a motel on Route 66. About a woman who walked in, out of the rain, bleeding from a gunshot wound. A woman who paid her in cash to hide her." Garrett's 2 men shifted uneasily, finally realizing the gravity of the room. They looked at Thomas and Cole, calculating the angles, realizing they were outgunned and out of position. "I don't know what kind of pills this waitress is on, Declan," Garrett said, forcing a chuckle that sounded like grinding rocks. "But you drag me out of bed at 3 a.m. for a campfire story. The woman in the motel lingered for 6 months. Declan continued, his voice echoing mercilessly. She died in agony. Far from home. Far from her husband. Garrett took a half-step back. The politician's mask was cracking, peeling away to reveal the raw, panicked animal underneath. Dec, look. You're overtired. The grief. It plays tricks on the mind. It makes you want to believe crazy things. You need to go home. You need to rest. Declan stopped 3 feet in front of Garrett. He reached into the inside pocket of his cashmere coat. I brought you something, Declan whispered. He pulled his hand out and held it up under the harsh glare of the caged light bulb. Between his thumb and forefinger dangled the silver chain. At the bottom, spinning slowly, was the heavy sapphire surrounded by crushed diamonds. The blue stone caught the light, casting a sharp, azure reflection directly into Garrett's eyes. Garrett stopped breathing. All the color drained from his face, leaving his skin the shade of the hanging meat surrounding them. He stared at the necklace, his pupils dilating in pure, unadulterated terror. He knew that stone. He had watched Declan place it around Camille's neck. He had watched Camille wear it at the syndicate's charity galas. He thought it had burned in the wreckage. He thought the fire had erased all his sins. She survived the garage, Garrett, Declan said, his voice dropping to a terrifying, intimate whisper. She drove through the gate with a bullet in her side. You burned a stranger to cover your tracks. You stood next to me at her funeral and put a hand on my shoulder, while they lowered an empty casket into the ground. Dec! Garrett gasped, his voice cracking. He raised his hands, palms out, a gesture of surrender. Dec, listen to me, please. Thomas, Declan said without looking away. Behind Garrett, 2 muffled thwips cut through the hum of the freezers. Garrett flinched as hot blood sprayed the back of his camel hair coat. His 2 bodyguards dropped to the concrete floor in unison, identical bullet holes in the back of their skulls. Thomas and Cole lowered their suppressed weapons, stepping over the fresh corpses to box Garrett in. Garrett's knees buckled. He dropped heavily to the frozen floor, his expensive slacks soaking up the icy water and the pooling blood of his men. He looked up at Declan, his chest heaving, the air tearing through his lungs in ragged gasps. It wasn't supposed to happen like that, Garrett screamed, the panic finally breaking through the dam. She found the ledger's deck. She found the offshore accounts. You were stealing from me, Declan said, his face expressionless. I would have forgiven the money, Garrett. You were blood. If you were short, you just had to ask. It wasn't just the money, Garrett yelled, a hysterical edge to his voice. Tears streamed down his face, freezing to his cheeks. The feds had me, Declan. They had me dead to rights on the extortion rackets in the seaport. They told me I give them the syndicate, I give them you, or I do consecutive life sentences in ADX Florence. I couldn't do a box deck. I couldn't die in a cage. So you put my wife in one, Declan replied. She was going to tell you. Garrett sobbed, crawling forward, reaching for the hem of Declan's coat. I told her to walk away. I begged her. I told her I had it under control. But she pulled a gun on me. She was going to shoot me. Declan, I reacted. It was instinct. Declan looked down at the man, begging at his feet. He didn't feel anger anymore. The rage that had consumed him in the diner had burned itself out, leaving only ash and cold certainty. He thought about Camille. He thought about her lying in a cheap motel bed, sweating through cheap sheets, clutching her side, while the infection slowly ate her alive. He thought about her refusing to call him, refusing to bring him into the crosshairs of a federal trap, choosing to die quietly in the desert, so he wouldn't tear the city apart, looking for a ghost. She had protected him until her dying breath. You let her die in a motel, Garrett, Declan said. You let her rot for 6 months, while you sat in my dining room, eating my food, drinking my wine, and feeding my empire to the FBI. "I'm sorry," Garrett choked out, burying his face in his hands. "I'm so sorry, Deck. Give me a pass. Take my territory. Strip me down. Banish me. I'll leave the country. You'll never see me again. I swear to God, you'll never see me again." Declan pulled a heavy suppressed .45 caliber pistol from the holster at the small of his back. He thumbed the safety off. The mechanical click sounded like a vault door slamming shut. Garrett looked up, staring down the black, gaping barrel of the gun. The begging stopped. He saw the finality in Declan's eyes. There was no negotiation here. There was no mercy. There was only a debt 30 years in the making, finally coming due. "For 6 months," Declan said quietly. He didn't aim for the head. Declan pointed the gun at the right side of Garrett's abdomen, the exact spot where Garrett had put a bullet into Camille. Thwip. The heavy round punched through Garrett's expensive coat, tearing through muscle intestine and bone before lodging in the concrete floor beneath him. Garrett screamed. It was a high, tearing sound, a noise a human being should never be able to make. He collapsed onto his side, curling into a tight fetal position, clutching his stomach as dark blood rapidly spilled across the frost, steaming in the cold air. "You're not going to die quickly," Declan said, stepping back so the blood wouldn't touch his shoes. "You're going to lie here in the freezing cold. You're going to feel the frostbite set in before the blood loss takes you. It might take hours. Use the time to think about Arizona." Garrett couldn't speak. He just gurgled, writhing on the floor in absolute agony, his fingers digging uselessly into the slick concrete. Declan turned his back on him. He didn't feel a sense of triumph. He didn't feel avenged. He just felt exhausted. The ghost of his wife was finally laid to rest, but the silence she left behind was louder than ever. "Thomas," Declan said, walking toward the exit. "Boss. Lock the doors from the outside. Cut the power to the heaters in the administration office. Let this room drop to sub-zero." "Understood. Then mobilize the crews," Declan ordered, pushing the heavy steel door open, stepping out into the biting Boston night. "I want every Captain Garrett appointed over the last 4 years stripped of their ranks. I want his offshore accounts frozen. Find his handlers at the FBI. Leak their names to the cartels. By sunrise, I want Garrett's entire legacy erased from this city." The rain had stopped leaving the streets of Boston, slick and reflective, mirroring the harsh yellow glow of the street lamps. The sky over the harbor was beginning to bruise a dark, bruised purple, giving way to the weak grey light of dawn. Declan sat in the back of his armored SUV, staring out the tinted window. The heater blasted warm air over his frozen legs, but the cold from the warehouse seemed permanently lodged in his marrow. He held the sapphire necklace in his left hand, his thumb running over the tiny, imperceptible flaw on the bottom clasp. Garrett was dead. His empire was currently bleeding out the traitors in a surgical, ruthless purge that would make headlines for weeks. The feds would scramble, the rival families would cower, and the Rossi syndicate would lock down the city with an iron grip. Declan had won. He had survived the coup. But as the SUV navigated the empty streets, Declan realized none of it mattered. The money, the power, the fear, it was all ash. "Where to, boss?" Cole asked from the driver's seat, his eyes flicking to the rearview mirror. "Back to the estate." Declan thought about the sprawling mansion in Chestnut Hill, the empty halls, the pristine, untouched rooms, the echoing silence that waited for him there. He couldn't go back. Not tonight. Not ever again, maybe. "No," Declan said. "Take me back to the diner." Cole didn't question the order. He spun the heavy steering wheel, the SUV executing a smooth U-turn on the slick asphalt, heading back toward the industrial district. The Starlight Diner looked even more pathetic in the early morning light. The neon sign buzzed aggressively, the T in starlight, flickering on and off like a dying heartbeat. There were no other cars in the lot. Declan pushed the heavy door open and stepped out. He told Thomas and Cole to wait in the car. He didn't need muscle for this. He pushed through the glass door, the small bell above it, chiming cheerfully, completely, at odds with the gravity of the man walking in. The diner was empty. The shattered glass from the coffee pot had been swept up the floor, mopped, leaving a faint smell of industrial lemon cleaner hanging in the air. Amelia was sitting at the counter. She had taken off her apron. She was wearing a worn denim jacket over her uniform, a battered canvas tote bag sitting on the stool next to her. She held a mug of tea in both hands, staring blankly at the wall behind the grill. She looked up when the bell chimed. She didn't flinch when she saw Declan. She just watched him walk toward her, recognizing the subtle shift in his posture. The frantic, desperate energy was gone. He walked with a heavy, terrible calm. Declan stopped on the other side of the counter. "He's dead," Declan said simply. He didn't elaborate. He didn't need to. Amelia slowly nodded, taking a sip of her tea. Did it help? The question caught Declan off guard. He had surrounded himself with men of violence for so long that he had forgotten how normal people thought. His men would have asked how it went, how much blood was spilled, who was taking over the territory. Amelia just asked the only question that actually mattered. Declan looked down at the laminate counter. "No," he admitted, his voice rough. "It didn't. She's still gone." "She is," Amelia agreed softly. "Vengeance doesn't bring them back. It just makes you tired." Declan looked up at her. He studied her face. She was exhausted, pale and struggling. She had risked her life to carry a dead woman's secret halfway across the country, walking into the den of a monster, just to keep a promise. She didn't want a reward. She just wanted to do the right thing. "Why did you do it?" Declan asked. "Why didn't you just sell the necklace? It's worth $500,000. You could have started over anywhere. Instead, you worked graveyard shifts in a dive diner, waiting for a ghost to walk through the door." Amelia smiled. It was a sad, tired smile. "Because she was my friend. For 6 months in that awful, sweltering room, she was the only real friend I had. She talked about you like you hung the moon, Declan. She knew what you were. She knew the blood on your hands. But she loved you anyway. She said you were a man who carried the world on his shoulders, and she didn't want you carrying her death, too." Amelia reached into her pocket and pulled out a small folded piece of paper. It was yellowed with age, the edges frayed. "She wrote this," Amelia said, sliding the paper across the counter. "A week before she passed. She couldn't hold the pen very well, so I had to help her guide it. She told me to give it to you when I gave you the necklace." Declan's breath hitched. His massive hand, the hand that had just orchestrated the execution of his oldest friend without a tremor, shook violently as he reached for the paper. He carefully unfolded it. The handwriting was erratic, jagged, the ink pooling in places where the pen had stalled. But it was undeniably hers. "My Declan, if you are reading this, the girl kept her promise. Do not be angry. Do not burn the world down. I ran because I had to protect you. I am tired, my love, so very tired. But I am not afraid. I have lived 100 lifetimes in the years I spent with you. Garrett broke my body, but he could not touch my soul. Let him go. Let all of it go. You have waged enough wars. It is time to rest. Find the sun for me. Be a good man. I will be waiting. Forever, Camille." A single drop of water hit the paper, smudging the blue ink on the word forever. Declan realized with a profound sense of shock that he was crying. The mob boss, the king of the Boston underworld, stood in a greasy diner and broke down. The grief didn't come with the violent fury it had earlier. It came like a rising tide, quiet, devastating, and entirely overwhelming. He gripped the edge of the counter, bowing his head, his broad shoulders shaking as years of repressed agony finally poured out of him. Amelia didn't look away. She didn't offer empty platitudes. She simply stood up, walked around the counter, and wrapped her arms around the massive broken man. She held him while he wept for the wife he had lost twice. For the first time in 4 years, Declan Rossi wasn't entirely alone in the dark. Dawn broke over Boston, like a bruised eye purple and swollen with cold rain. Inside the diner, the fluorescent lights hummed their cheap electric tune. Declan stepped back from Amelia, wiping a rough hand across his face. The dampness on his cheeks felt foreign, exposed. Yet for the first time in 1,000 days, the crushing weight in his chest had receded. He looked at the waitress. Her denim jacket was worn thin at the elbows. She had nothing. She had risked everything for a woman she barely knew, and now, by proximity, she was standing in the blast radius of a Mafia war. "You can't stay here," Declan said, his voice thick but steady. He folded Camille's letter, tucking it into his breast pocket behind the heavy sapphire. Garrett had men, handlers, people who will come looking for answers when they find him freezing to the floor of a meat locker. "You're a loose end, Amelia." Amelia crossed her arms, rubbing her shoulders against the draft, creeping in through the diner's cheap windows. "I don't have anywhere to go, Declan. My rent is 2 weeks late, and my car needs a new alternator just to make it out of the city limits." "You don't need a car," Declan replied. He turned toward the door. "Come with me." She didn't hesitate. She grabbed her canvas tote, walked out from behind the counter, and followed him out into the freezing morning. Thomas and Cole were waiting by the SUV. They watched Amelia approach with guarded indifference. Muscle didn't ask questions. They just opened the doors. "Take us to the Chestnut Hill estate," Declan ordered, as he climbed into the back. The ride was silent. Amelia watched the city slip by through the tinted glass, the decaying brick of the industrial district, giving way to the manicured lawns and iron gates of Boston's elite. When they pulled up to Declan's sprawling stone mansion, Amelia hesitated, her worn sneakers pausing on the pristine cobblestone driveway. It looked less like a home and more like a fortress. Inside the house was a mausoleum. Everything was draped in sterile perfection. Hardwood floors gleamed without a single scuff mark. The air smelled of lemon polish and expensive nothingness. Declan led her to the kitchen, a massive expanse of marble and stainless steel. "Sit," he said, gesturing to a stool. He walked over to a heavy oak cabinet, pulled out a false bottom, and retrieved a thick leather satchel. He dropped it on the island counter. The zipper gave a heavy, satisfying sound as he pulled it open. Banded stacks of $100 bills sat neatly inside. Beside them, 3 blank passports, untraceable burner phones, and the keys to a safe house in Vancouver. "There's $200,000 in cash here," Declan said, pushing the satchel toward her. "Enough to start over anywhere. New name, new city. You disappear today." Amelia looked at the money. She didn't reach for it. She looked up at Declan, studying the deep lines etched around his mouth. "What are you going to do?" Declan turned away, looking out the massive bay windows toward the sprawling, empty back lawn. "Let all of it go," Camille had written. "You have waged enough wars. It is time to rest." "I'm tearing it down," Declan said quietly. He didn't wait for her to respond. He walked into his home office, a dark room, panelled in mahogany, and picked up the secure landline on his desk. He dialed a number he hadn't called in years. "Arthur," Declan said, when the line clicked open. Arthur was the oldest capo in the New England families, a man who survived 3 decades of bloodshed by staying neutral and running the construction unions quietly. "Declan?" Arthur rasped, his voice thick with sleep. "It's 5 in the morning, and my guys are telling me Garrett's crew is getting gutted on the streets. Garrett was a rat. He's dead. His lieutenants are dead or running." Declan leaned his knuckles on the leather-bound surface of his desk. "Call a sit-down, all the remaining bosses. Noon today at the Cigar Club. A sit-down December if you're claiming his territory. You don't need a meeting. You're the undisputed king now." "I'm not claiming anything," Declan replied, his voice devoid of ego. "I'm out." Silence hummed over the encrypted line. "Say again," Arthur whispered. "I'm stepping down. Today. I'm handing the ledgers, the routes, and the waterfront over to you, Arthur. You distribute it how you see fit. You keep the peace. I take my personal accounts, and I vanish. Anyone who tries to follow me, anyone who knocks on my door gets put in the ground. But if you let me walk, the city is yours. You can't just walk away from the throne, Declan. Men die for that seat." "I did," Declan said, "and the cost was too high. Noon, Arthur. Have the papers ready." He hung up the phone. The click echoed in the large, empty room. It was done. A 30-year empire dismantled with a single phone call. He walked back into the kitchen. Amelia was still sitting at the island. The satchel of money remained untouched. "I don't want to go to Vancouver," she said softly. Declan stopped. "It's safe there. I hate the cold," she replied, offering a faint, weary smile. She looked at the man who had just surrendered a city. "I came back east to find you, to finish her story. But I think we both need to see where it ended, to actually let it go." Declan felt a tightness in his throat. He thought of the dusty motel off Route 66, the place where his wife took her last breath. He realized Amelia was right. He couldn't just walk away into a new life without closing the door on the old one. "Arizona," Declan breathed. "Arizona," Amelia confirmed. The heat hit them the moment they stepped out of the rental car, a dry, suffocating wall of air that smelled of baked asphalt and sagebrush. It had been 4 days since Declan signed over the Boston Syndicate. 4 days since he watched a room full of hardened killers stare at him in stunned silence as he threw the keys to the city on a poker table and walked out. He had left Thomas and Cole with massive severance packages, stripping himself of muscle of titles of the ghost he used to be. He wore a plain white t-shirt and faded jeans. The tailored suits were left in a dumpster behind Logan Airport. The Stardust Motel was exactly as Amelia had described. It was a rotting carcass of a building sitting on the edge of the highway, its neon sign, long dead, the paint peeling off the stucco walls in great leprous flakes. A rusted ice machine buzzed angrily near the front office. Amelia walked ahead of him, her boots kicking up small clouds of red dust. The gravel crunched under Declan's boots, sounding like breaking bones in the absolute quiet of the desert afternoon. "The owner is a guy named Hector," Amelia said, leading him past the front desk without checking in. "He doesn't care who comes or goes as long as nobody calls the cops." She walked to the very back of the lot. A narrow concrete walkway led to a row of doors facing a barren field of scrub brush and cracked earth. She stopped in front of a faded blue door. The brass number 9 hung crookedly from a single screw. Declan stopped 3 feet away. His chest tightened, the air suddenly too thin to breathe. He stared at the chipped paint. Behind that wood, his wife had spent half a year dying. Behind that wood, she had penned her final words to him. Amelia reached into her pocket, produced a worn brass key, and slid it into the lock. It clicked. She pushed the door open. The room smelled of stale cigarettes, old dust, and trapped heat. It was suffocatingly small. A single bed with a cheap floral bedspread took up most of the space. A rattling window unit blew tepid air into the room. A small television sat bolted to a cheap particle board dresser. Declan stepped across the threshold. The silence in the room was heavy, almost sacred. He walked slowly toward the bed. He reached out his large, calloused fingers, brushing against the cheap fabric of the mattress. He closed his eyes. In his mind, he didn't see the broken, bleeding woman Amelia had described. He saw Camille as she was on their wedding day, radiant laughing, pulling him onto the dance floor while the band played Sinatra. But as he opened his eyes, the reality of the room grounded him. He saw a dark, faded stain on the cheap carpet near the bathroom door. Blood. Her blood. His knees finally gave out. The former King of Boston collapsed onto the edge of the cheap motel bed, burying his face in his large hands. The grief he had held back for 4 years, the grief he had twisted into violence and rage, finally broke entirely. He wept loudly, his broad shoulders heaving the sounds of his sorrow, echoing off the thin, dirty walls. Amelia didn't offer empty words. She didn't tell him it was going to be okay, because some things are never okay. They just become part of the scar tissue. She walked over, sat down on the mattress beside him, and placed a hand on the center of his back. She rubbed slow, grounding circles between his shoulder blades. She anchored him to the present, absorbing the shock waves of his pain. They sat like that for an hour. The desert sun began its slow descent, painting the dusty windows in shades of violent orange and deep violet. When Declan finally sat up, his eyes were red and swollen, but the hollow, dead look that had defined his face for 4 years was gone. He looked exhausted. He looked human. She talked about the ocean a lot, Amelia whispered, staring at the dust motes dancing in the fading light. She said you promised to buy her a house on the water one day. Somewhere the winters didn't hurt. Declan looked at Amelia. He saw the kindness in her face, the quiet resilience that had carried Camille through her darkest hours. Amelia wasn't Camille. She would never be Camille. But she was a survivor, just like him. They were 2 people walking away from the wreckage of their pasts, carrying the same ghost. I know a place, Declan said, his voice a gravelly whisper. On the coast. Far from here. Far from Boston. Amelia looked back at him, the corner of her mouth lifting into a small, genuine smile. I've never seen the ocean. Declan stood up. He reached down and offered her his hand. Let's go find the sun. The Pacific Ocean smelled vastly different from the Boston harbor. There was no scent of rust industry or frozen meat. It smelled of salt, blooming jasmine, and warm, wet sand. A year had passed since the door to room 9 clicked shut. The small coastal town in Northern California didn't care about a man's past. The locals cared if you paid your tabs on time and kept your property clean. Declan lived in a modest 2-story cedar house, perched on a cliff overlooking the grey-blue expanse of the water. The man sitting on the back porch didn't look like a mob boss. He wore faded canvas work pants and a soft Henley shirt, the sleeves pushed up to reveal forearms dusted with sawdust. He was sanding a piece of driftwood, moving the block in slow, rhythmic circles. The pale scar on his jaw was still there, but the tension underneath it had dissolved. The sliding glass door behind him rolled open. Amelia stepped out onto the deck carrying 2 mugs of coffee. Her auburn hair was tied back in a loose braid, and she wore a flour-dusted apron over a sundress. 3 months ago, with the cash from the leather satchel, she had bought an abandoned bakery in the town square. She spent her mornings kneading dough instead of pouring stale coffee for junkies and killers. She handed Declan a mug. The oven thermostat is acting up again, she said, leaning against the wooden railing, looking out at the horizon. I might need you to come down and look at it. I'm a carpenter now. Amelia. Not an electrician, Declan murmured, taking a sip of the coffee. It was good. Perfect, actually. But I'll take a look after I finish this frame. He nodded toward the piece of driftwood. He was carving a shadow box. They didn't talk much about Boston. They didn't talk about Garrett or the syndicate or the life Declan had left behind. They lived in a quiet, comfortable rhythm. They weren't lovers in the fiery, chaotic sense of the word. They were partners in healing. A deep, unbreakable tether existed between them, forged in the fires of a shared tragedy. Amelia looked down at the small wooden table next to Declan's chair. Resting on a velvet cloth was the heavy sapphire necklace. The crushed diamonds caught the early morning light, shimmering with a brilliant, clean fire. It wasn't hidden in a pocket anymore. It wasn't a secret. It was just a beautiful thing left behind by a beautiful woman. It belongs in the box, Declan said, catching her gaze. He set his sandpaper down and picked up the necklace. The silver chain felt cool against his skin. I'm going to hang it in the hallway, where the light hits it in the afternoon. She would like that, Amelia said softly. Declan stood up, groaning slightly as his knees popped. He walked over to the railing, standing shoulder to shoulder with Amelia. The sun was just beginning to break over the eastern hills behind them, casting long golden beams across the water, turning the breaking waves into liquid amber. The air was warm. The world was quiet. Declan placed a hand on Amelia's shoulder, a gesture of profound, silent gratitude. She reached up and rested her hand over his. He closed his eyes, feeling the warmth of the California sun on his face. He thought of the letter tucked safely away in his desk drawer upstairs. Find the sun for me. Be a good man. Declan opened his eyes and watched a lone seagull dive toward the surf. For the first time in his adult life, he wasn't looking over his shoulder. He wasn't calculating an angle. He was just a man, standing in the light, finally at peace. He had found the sun, and he was going to make sure it never set on them again. What a journey! From the darkest corners of a Boston winter to the healing warmth of the California coast, Declan's story proves that sometimes the only way to win a war is to finally put down your weapon. Grief can turn us into monsters, but forgiveness and a shared burden can make us human again. If this story moved you, please hit that like button and share it with someone who appreciates a deeply emotional, grounded narrative. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel and drop a comment below. Tell me, what would you have done if you were in Declan's shoes at the diner? See you in the next one.